Hi guys. Here I'm going to just be talking about the difference between nomothetic causal explanations and idiographic causal explanations. So when we're talking about causality, nomothetic causal explanations are kind of the most commonly used ones, where we're saying when we have two variables that we think are related, then when the independent variable changes, then that's going to be followed by predictable variation in the dependent variable. And so this ceteris paribus just means when all else is equal. That's just what that means. So when everything else stays the same, then a change in the independent variable is going to change the dependent variable in a predictable way. And so we can say that, you know, as one goes up, as the independent variable goes up, the dependent variable goes up, or as the independent variable goes up, the dependent variable goes down, or some other, maybe curvilinear or some other relationship, but it's some kind of predictable relationship. And so the dependent variable then values are going to differ from what they would have been in the absence of the independent variable. So this is what's called the counterfactual. And the counterfactual is kind of a weird concept. It's basically like this hypothetical, what would have happened had that independent variable either not been there or not had an effect. And so it's not the same as a control, but it's kind of like that idea. So for example, if we were to look at some event, and so let's say, let's look at riots. And so if we're looking at riots or not violent sort of gatherings and things like that, if we were to sort of look at a riot, let's say, and say, well, you know, it was, you know, the political unrest, or in the case of the Vancouver riot, of losing a hockey game. But basically, if there's a variable that we think causes that thing to happen, so the more political unrest in an area, the more likely you're going to have riots. Well, then the counterfactual would be that, you know, these riots would not have happened had the political unrest not been there. And so the counterfactual is like, well, because if we're saying that political unrest causes riots to happen, then that means that in the absence of those things, those riots would not have happened. In the absence of that political unrest, the riots would not have happened. So it's kind of like a control that, well, if we had a situation where there was no political unrest, then we should see no riots, if that is a truly causal explanation. But it's hypothetical, so we can never actually know what the counterfactual is. We can only give an educated guess, because the counterfactual by definition didn't happen, so we can't ever know what it really would have been. So maybe the riot would have happened anyways. We don't know for sure, but it's our best guess given what we know about the causality. So if there is a truly causal relationship between two variables, then that means that if the if the independent variable had not happened, then the dependent variable wouldn't have happened the way that it did. So that's kind of the way the counterfactual works. You can kind of think of it like as a control, but it's not an actual thing that happened. It's a hypothetical. And so definitely the nomothetic causal explanation is the most researched type of causality. It's the basic, when X happens, Y happens sort of situation. And then compare that to the idiographic causal explanation, which is much more often done with qualitative research, but it's kind of like a story. So an idiographic causal explanation kind of tells all of the, you know, what led up to this thing that we're trying to explain. So we'll keep with the riot example, and instead of saying that, well, in areas with higher levels of political unrest, we see more riots. That's a nomothetic causal explanation. The idiographic causal explanation would be, well, what led up to each individual riot? So we can go back and we can trace the series of events or actions or something that happened and that resulted in that final event or outcome. And so you have these initial conditions that are in place that you would explain within the idiographic causal explanation, plus there's some kind of series of events that then follows those initial conditions that leads to your final outcome. So very much idiographic causal explanations are about context. It's all about what's leading to that particular situation. So if we're talking about riots, or maybe we want to look at something like, you know, a homicide or something like that. What is it that led up to that person committing that crime? That would be telling their story, which would be the idiographic causal explanation, all about the context that led that person to commit that crime. And so when you're talking about, well, how do you know that, the story that I tell is better than the story that another person might tell? And the simple answer is you don't. If I'm trying to explain homicide, and I'm looking at a particular case of homicide, well then I could go back and say, well, clearly there are childhood factors at play, or there was very little attachment when this person was growing up, and so they didn't have strong bonds with a maternal figure, and so then that caused problems with attachment going forward, and then they couldn't develop positive social relationships, and then that led them to act out and then become a murderer. But somebody else might look at that same case and say, well, there are biological factors at play, and this person had the ADHD and maybe bipolar or something like that, and those were what are related. It wasn't dealt with properly in their family, and that's what led to this. So there's no really way to know that any causal narrative is better than another. Or if we look at one homicide case versus another homicide case, and so it might not be the same factors. So, and there's no real way to know which one is best. It's just, well, it's our best guess as what we can use to explain a certain case. It may just be the best explanation for a particular case or a particular set of cases, depending on what we're looking at, but it's still based on the researcher's best guess as to how everything all fits together. So nomothetic causal explanations are about, this is the relationship between X and Y, and here's how we can show that relationship. Typically, this is quantitative methods using statistics. And then idiographic causal explanation is just, well, what's the story, all the steps that led up to this thing that we're trying to explain. So very different take on causality. And that's it for nomothetic versus idiographic.